Hi, I'm Deanna Joe, and welcome to my channel, Responsible Faith. Today, I would like to talk about the topic of Christian women wearing pants. And again, this is going to seem like another one of those strange conversations to be having. But if you've grown up in a holiness type movement like the United Pentecostal Church, certain Wesleyan groups, certain Baptist groups, this was a problem. So I spent a whole day this past week listening to YouTube videos and reading articles from people who were making an argument against women wearing pants. By the end of the day, I was so grouchy, it wasn't even funny. It took me a whole sleeve of mini chocolate bars just to make it through that day. And so I'll try to keep my attitude in check here. Now, this subject does anger me, and it angers me because as a young woman who grew up in the United Pentecostal Church, this little doctrine cost me a lot, and nobody really seemed that bothered by it. I couldn't play organized sports because I couldn't wear the uniform, and of course, we weren't allowed to play organized sports either back then. They've let up on that some now, but you know what? It's not that I was super athletic. I would have loved, though, to try out for the volleyball team and the softball team. I had a great class of girls I would have loved to have gotten to know and been part of a team with and to have been playing sports with. That's not something you can ever go back and redo. Like, that's over, it's gone, but I feel a little bit robbed, I'll be honest with you. There's a lot of activities that you can't just easily do in a skirt that, you just avoid. They're just the matter of fashion. Let's be honest, nobody wants to stand out when they are in middle school and high school, and especially not for something, in my case, that I didn't even believe in. And so let's just jump into it. The main verse they use, they have almost nothing to build this doctrine on, but the main verse they use is in the Old Testament, Deuteronomy 22, verse 5. It says, "A woman shall not wear a man's garment, nor shall a man put on a woman's cloak, for whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord your God," or Yahweh. So then what you have is you have the King James Version, which translated it much broader and said, "The woman shall not wear that which pertaineth unto a man, neither shall a man put on a woman's garment, for all that do are an abomination to the Lord thy God." So if we go back to the English Standard Version, because let's be honest, that which pertaineth to a man, that could be anything. Gloves, mittens, scarves, hats, snow boots, winter coats, like to say that pants are any different from the rest of that stuff, but that's the thing they chose. So if you go back to the English Standard Version, it says, "A woman shall not wear a man's garment." That Hebrew word is actually originally the word kali, and it's an article, utensil, vessel, armor, or tools. So neither shall a man put on a woman's cloak, and the Hebrew word there is simlah, which is a wrapper, mantle, or cloak. For whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord your God, or to Yahweh. And so I watched a young woman with a fashion channel on YouTube, and she has a video called "Why Men Wear Pants and Women Wear Skirts," and it's excellent. You really need to go watch it. I'm going to link it in the description section down below. It's only 7 minutes long, and it's a historical account, but it's really good. And so I'm also going to share other links and resources if this is something that you want to study out, just some other articles you might want to read. But she shared a translation, which I thought seemed closer to the actual meaning once you start looking up the original Hebrew words. And it said, "The woman shall not put on the weapons or armor of a warrior, neither shall a warrior put on a woman's garment, for all who do so are an abomination to the Lord thy God," or Yahweh. So what does that mean? Women aren't to wear men's armor. Men aren't to wear a woman's cloak. Is it talking about cross-dressing? Well, I highly doubt it. You think it would have mentioned men's clothes, not just their armor. Is it them switching traditional gender roles? I don't know. That seems a little unlikely. Some people will say that maybe the men were trying to get out of going to war by disguising themselves as women. I don't know. I mean, there were provisions made for people who were faint of heart. So the thing that I came across that I felt stood out to me was the idolatry one. Could it have been a matter of idolatry? The whole Old Testament is Yahweh trying to get the children of Israel to stop worshiping other gods. And so I read 2 commentaries that both kind of pointed to that. And it said that there were customs of idol worship at that time, And they found writings that describe pagan commandments, that when a man worshiped the star of Venus, he was to wear a colored women's garment, and that when a woman worshiped the star of Mars, she was to put on a coat of mail and warlike armor. So that's kind of a good description of it. I mean, that's pretty specific. One rabbi believed that another reason could have been that it would have led to lust and whoredom as well, which, I mean, that was what they were all doing. So there were documents that confirmed that such customs existed amongst the heathen nations. They had Venus as the moon, and the men had to sacrifice to her in women's garments and women in men's. And so the reason for that was that the ancient peoples believed that Venus was both male and female. So to come before her, they had to represent both genders. And so the fact that the children of Israel were coming into those countries at that time could have been what prompted this verse to be written, to warn them, don't be doing this. You've made a promise and a covenant to worship Yahweh alone, and don't be worshiping these other gods. Now, the Cambridge Bible for Schools and Colleges, which is another commentary, basically says the same thing, that they were pagan worship rituals, and that could have been the reason for this verse. To me, it makes most sense. But anyways, we'll never know for sure until we know all. But the Deuteronomy 22:5 people who believe that pants are that which pertaineth to a man, they usually then make the jump to the abomination portion of the scripture, and then, of course, to hell, because everything's about taking you to hell. And so they go to Revelation 21, verse 27. It says, but nothing unclean will ever enter it, nor anyone who practices an abomination or a lie, but only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life. So they're like, okay, there you go. No one who practices an abomination is going to enter it. What's it? So the implication there would be that it's talking about heaven. But if you read that chapter, it's actually talking about, that's already been decided. You've got the new heaven, you've got the new earth, everything's set up for the millennial reign. You have the holy city, the new Jerusalem coming down out of heaven, and it is there, and the kings of the surrounding nations will come there and check in. You have the gates that never close from the holy city, because there's no night, because the Lamb is the light. He provides the light. And so that's what it's talking about when it says nothing unclean will ever enter it. It's talking about the holy city, Jerusalem, in the millennial reign. That's the other part of their doctrine that it doesn't hold up. So if you go back to Deuteronomy 22, a lot of them will say, well, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so that's their argument. If he said it then, he means it now. And of course, they're taking a lot of liberty in trying to make it say pants. But I would have to point out that if you're going to approach me for a conversation about clothing based on Deuteronomy chapter 22, I would prefer, sir, that you don't approach me unless you have your tzitzits on the four corners of your garment, which should likely be a prayer shawl of some kind. And if you don't know what that is, it says in verse 12 that they should have tassels at the four corners of their garment. So if you're going to go back to Torah to drag over and nitpick individual little rules and laws that you want to bring over from the Mosaic covenant and you want to apply to Christians, then you're walking a fine line, because there is a pile of them. And James 2:10 says, for whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles at just one point is guilty of breaking it all. I don't think any of us want to go under the law at this point. So another weak example of pants/breeches that they will sometimes use is Exodus 28:42. And it's talking about the garments that they were going to make for the high priests for when they went into the Holy of Holies to do ministry. And it said, you shall make for them linen undergarments to cover their naked flesh. They shall reach from the hips to the thighs. But the King James Version translated it breeches. And so you have people using that verse to prove that, see, there was pants. That was the first time that we heard about pants, and they were just for the men. No, they were underwear. And the only time they wore them was when they went in there, and it never mentions women wearing them. So I don't think that's a conversation you want to have. And so they really do have to grasp at straws. to imply that it's sinful or wrong for a woman to wear pants. And so let's take a look at the origin of pants. So obviously, early on, everybody wore robes. In fact, in the garden, when God made clothing for Adam and Eve, if you look up that word, it's a tunic, and he made them the same thing. There's no distinction there. That would have been a perfect place for him to make them two very different garments to show that there needs to be a distinction between the clothing. And pants, that would have been a great time to bring pants. It's not like God didn't know what was going to play out in history. He could have just put this whole subject to rest by doing that if this was a big deal. So why did men switch from their original clothing? I mean, they wore robes and tunics and kimonos and even kilts. Why did they switch to pants? Activity. Based on what I've read in history, you have a lot of it has to do with riding horses and what was warm and comfortable and what was convenient. And since men's activities were traditionally more physical than women's and probably more demanding physically, you have men who they're the ones that mostly wore pants early on and trousers and knickers and tights. So for many years, it was predominantly men, but that's not to say that women never did. So according to Wikipedia, trousers first entered recorded history in the 6th century BC, and they found them displayed on rock carvings and in artwork showing horse riding Eurasians. And it was from back that time. And so at the same time, you had Iranian peoples, Armenians, and people from East and Central Asia. They were also known to have worn trousers. And an interesting point here is it was believed that both the men and women wore them for certain activities. So you had the ancient Greeks at the time. Well, they didn't wear trousers. They thought it was ridiculous and scorned the peoples around them who did. And you had the Romans who admired the Greeks. And they figured that the Greek attire was the mark of civilization. But then as the Roman Empire expanded and they sort of left the Mediterranean basin and expanded out where it wasn't quite so warm, they had a big revelation that maybe pants weren't so silly and they started wearing them for warmth. So then when did it become mainstream for women to start wearing pants on a regular basis? Although we have read, and you can easily find that throughout history, women did wear trousery pants type things from time to time based on activity. But for the mainstream wearing of pants, you've got the late 1800s, bicycles came in fashion. And you have a form of bloomers that were introduced for women's athletic attire. And the lady who designed them designed this little shorter dress and these baggy pantaloon type bottoms. And her last name was Bloomers. I think it was Bloomer or Bloomers. And they named them after her, and that's where that came from. So by the time you hit the turn of the century, you had women participating in horseback riding and tennis and various sports for leisure activities that required better attire, basically. But then by World War I and World War II, you had women who were forced into society to take on both roles while the men were away at war. And so you had women working in factories and even like wartime service jobs. And they wore pants as the jobs demanded it. In fact, a lot of them probably wore their husbands' clothing and their husbands' work uniforms. And so so in Britain, actually, the rationing of clothing was what prompted the women there to wear their husband's civilian clothes to work while their husbands served. And that was partly because it was practical for what they were doing, and partly because it freed up their clothing allowance for other family needs, which I think is pretty honorable. And I've also heard the argument, which I'd never heard this before till I started studying this, but that feminism brought in the wearing of pants, and feminism was championed by lesbians. So the whole spirit behind wearing pants was cross-dressing. Of course, it therefore must be shunned. So I know how stupid that sounds, but I honestly heard it more than once, so I felt like I should address it. I think we've already covered that historically, going way, way back, women have worn pants for a long time. But if you read about the feminist movement, there were conservative women, there were liberal women, there likely were lesbian women, and there were men who came together and who fought and championed the cause of women, fought for and championed the cause of women's rights. And they were trying to win basic human societal rights for women. And I think that's something very few sensible men would oppose. This nasty talk of women getting the right to vote and feminism back in the day as an excuse for everything, I don't like that. In the 1920s, women gained the right to vote. And they fought for reforms in higher education, the workplace, and healthcare. And they also gained the right to divorce. And you might not think that's a good thing, but I'll tell you, in an abusive situation, some of those women, it was a matter of their own personal safety as well as the safety of their children. They also improved sexual assault and rape laws, and they also fought for the right for females to inherit. So the idea that women were just looking to become men, and that included attire, and it was all about, that is so foolish and diminishing to the real spirit of the feminist movement, which was dignity, it was bodily autonomy, it was fairness, and it was safety for women. And so in regards to clothing, cultural norms greatly contribute towards deciding what's appropriate to wear. If I plucked a UPC, a very conservative UPC or a Wesleyan holiness lady, and I dropped her in the middle of the Victorian era, they would take one look at her in her outfit and they would think she was scandalously dressed. Her lack of layers alone would have made her outfit just be the talk of the town, and she would have been considered immodest. And so it's cultural. You can't pretend culture doesn't play a role. And for men who thinks that there needs to be this great distinction between men and women's clothing, well, the first thing I would do is point you back to Bible times when they all wore robes and tunics. So a distinction did exist maybe in the ornamentation and stuff on the women's robes, but it wasn't this huge pants versus skirts distinction. But I would also challenge those men, go try on a pair of women's pants. Tell me how you make out. There's a distinction. And I would also mention, where's the glaring distinction between a men's dress shirt and a women's button front shirt, other than the fact that they button on opposite sides? And I mean, when you're wearing it and it's buttoned up, nobody can tell. So I've also heard other people say, oh, God convicted me. God convicted me of wearing pants, so I don't wear pants anymore. Look, honey, I am so happy for you. Congratulations, you have a personal conviction. Walk on, obey it, and keep it to yourself. That's what I would say. And you have a lot of people who feel that because they have more strict personal convictions, that they're more spiritual. Well, I don't know. If you go to the book of Romans 14, that would actually make you think that it's possible that you are a weaker brother or you're weaker in the faith. So it's not bragging rights. And others will say, well, it's a matter of modesty. And I am going to address that in an upcoming video I'm going to do where I discuss modesty. But there's no scripture that can be used as proof text that pants are wrong for women to wear. Historically, women have worn pants of some kind, be it knickers or whatever, for centuries. So the argument that it's only ever been men's apparel, that's silly. And in 2019, culture dictates that pants are appropriately and modestly worn by both men and women, just as robes and tunics were in the Bible. And so I'm going to leave you with this. Based on physical anatomy, if you want to make your argument from the modesty standpoint and shapes and all this stuff, for people who want to take it to the extreme, who do you think pants would be more modest for or more immodest for, I'll say? Men or women? Because maybe for the sake of modesty, some of these churches need to start bringing back the tunics for men to wear over their pants like some of the other cultures do. Because I would say if it was based solely on that, pants are probably less modest for men than they are for women. So anyway, that's just my 2 cents, rolling that out there. If you like my videos, you can hit the like button below and you can subscribe and hit the notification bell and you'll be notified whenever I make a new video. So anyway, have a great day.